All right, well, hello everybody. I don't know how many of you have a special interest in dragons personally. How many of you?
Personally?
Yeah.
Well, as in
Apart from as a radical anthropology group member. I think I'll go back to this first. I'll say something about my own interest in these. I've been doing research in Borneo, in Sarawak, which is on the island of Borneo but belongs to Malaysia, for the past 30 years. So I've been doing research among a particular tribe called the Kalabit, mostly. But 2 years ago, there was an opportunity to take up a fellowship at the Sarawak Museum, which was going to focus on animals and indigenous cosmologies. And I thought this sounds very interesting because I am actually quite interested in cosmological matters. I've become more and more interested in that as a topic in the past few years. And so I thought I'd take this up and I could look at dragons, because I'd come across what you could call dragons in my research among the Kalabit. They're called munagug there, which probably derives from the word naga. I hadn't particularly followed it up, but I thought these dragons are a way of understanding people's cosmologies, because they're very closely associated with beliefs about the flow of cosmic power, which is something that I'd been interested in. So I thought I would look at dragons and related beings, not just among the group that I'd been working among, but try to cover as many groups as possible in Sarawak. So I tackled as many as I could in that year when I had this research fellowship, and I'm continuing to do this. So this is about research in progress. It is basically the same as what I gave in December at SOAS, because I have been back since then. I've been back for 3 months, and I've probably got a little bit I can add here and there, but I haven't processed the material on the Chinese as yet. This is what I've started focusing on more. So is it yourself who, were you at the SOAS talk? Yes. Well, you're going to see more or less, you never know, something different could come out of me, because you never quite know what you're going to say. But it'll be interesting to talk further about this, because Chinese beliefs in the dragon are very central to understanding beliefs in Sarawak. Because Sarawak's been quite heavily influenced by the Chinese. So the Cantonese have a saying, we eat everything except the dragon, because we're not sure if it exists. Yes. This is something that I started thinking about because my uncle, who was a diplomat in China in the early 80s, in fact in the 70s as well, in Taiwan too before that, he told me this saying, and it got me thinking a bit. And we visited him in Guangzhou when myself and my husband were teaching in, this is my husband over there, that one over there. We were teaching in secondary schools on the east coast of Peninsular Malaysia in the early 80s, and we visited my uncle and sort of came across the fact that the Chinese really do eat all sorts of strange things. There was a sign up saying, "Good news, dog is for sale." And for us this is quite shocking from Europe, but it's quite normal in China. Sort of people eat everything, but the dragon, they're not sure if it exists. And actually it was interesting when I was talking to people about the dragon in Sarawak, and taxi drivers, people in the street, because people are very friendly there. They'll come up to you and talk to you. If they ever encounter you, they're just so interested in Europeans. They don't come across very many, and they're quite well disposed, so they ask you questions. You tell them what you're doing, and you tell them you're researching dragons, and they say, do you think they exist? They'd ask me this, So they're not sure whether they're material beings or spirit beings, actually. But on balance, they're probably spirit beings. But beliefs about them involve beliefs in transformation from material being to spirit being, actually. So that point where they transform is perhaps the question mark, you know. In fact, are they still material beings in some sense or not? So when I ask people these questions, they would then start telling me stories. First of all, they'd say that you know, they're not sure if they exist, and then they'd tell me stories about people encountering them. So I got a lot of stories like that, serendipitously. In fact, a lot of anthropological fieldwork is like that, really. You can't really organize the material you're going to get in advance. You get what you get a lot of the time. So in Borneo, there are many words for entities which we can describe in English as dragon. Now, we have to be careful using an English word to describe beliefs in other parts of the world. And you know, it's open to question whether one should use one term to describe all of these beliefs, even in Sarawak, let alone in the whole of the world. I'm really not sure if the fire-breathing dragons of Europe are really the same things as the ones in Southeast Asia. It's water that's significant in Southeast Asia. Fire, even in China, is only of secondary significance. It's still water that's particularly important, whereas in Europe it seems to be fire. But water comes into it too, I know. So we have to think carefully before we use one English term to translate these. But I'm using this term as a broad description because I think there are things that you can see in common, at least in the region, and at least in Sarawak at any rate, and probably in the broader region, which brings together the beliefs that different people have. So these are some of the terms that are used to describe what I'm calling the dragon among different groups. So there are many different tribal groups. There are Malays, there are Chinese. There were very few references in the literature and no focused research on these beliefs up till now. You find odd references here and there in the old literature and sometimes in more modern literature, but you know, it used to be that the anthropologists who did research, who were also administrative officers or had some other function, missionaries or whatever, they were very interested in these detailed beliefs, and so you actually get more bits of information in the older literature than you do in more modern research, which tends to be focused on a specific thing and isn't always so interested in odd little bits of beliefs. But there's not very much. There are references to beliefs in water spirits, and sometimes there are terms used locally given, but they don't usually use the word dragon, I should say. I think I need to have my glasses on the tip of my nose so I can actually see my notes a little better here. Now there are reports in the press and on the internet. It's quite interesting. If you go and put in dragon or any of these terms for Sarawak, you find various things. There's something which is called a stone naga in Unkalili, which is actually both Chinese and Iban, the Iban being a local tribal group, and some of it was discovered by a Chinese and a Thai man, and they began to leave offerings. So it's largely the Chinese, but it's near an Iban longhouse, and the Iban participate to some extent in this too. This is the Kutai Naga. This is actually an Indonesian Borneo. This is associated with the Raja in Kutai. So there are beliefs associating leaders and Rajas with these Naga, and I'll come back to that later. So the term Naga I'll come back to as well, but this comes from the West, from India. Yeah. Now, in the Sarawak Museum collection, and I was working with the Sarawak Museum, so obviously I looked at the objects in their collections. You have a lot of objects with dragons on, but they're not made mostly by tribal, well, some of them are. So they tend to be associated with the Chinese, or at least with coastal peoples. So you have jars, dragon jars, which are very widely disseminated among the tribal groups, but are made by either in China or in the coastal areas by Chinese. You have these bronzeware objects which are made in Brunei. And they're very interesting because there's very little information about who used to make them. That's one thing. I went to Brunei in February to try to follow this up because it's said by some Malays that it cannot have been Malays who made these, because Malays are not supposed to represent animals, you know, because they're Muslims. But in fact, it turns out from the discussions I had when I was in Brunei that it was Malays who made them, and indeed they're still making them, and they were in the process of making a bronze cannon in the shape of a naga for the Sultan of Brunei when I visited, actually. So still there's this strong association between Rajas and Sultans and these naga. Carved wooden naga. Some of the tribal groups carve naga, the ones that are closer to the coast. This is something which is often called an aso. It's a dragon dog, perhaps, sometimes described as a dragon dog, although there's debate about whether it is actually a dragon in any sense. However one might define whatever a dragon is. So I had a colleague who was working with me, Antonio Guerrero, in fact, working at the Sarawak Museum with me, who's quite adamant that these aso are not dragons. But I think they actually do express the same belief myself. And then you have these cloths made by the Iban people, which have naga woven into them, which are powerful and protective, and we'll come back to that. So what is the origin of this Borneo dragon, to use the English term? So it comes both from the naga in India, which is a being which is associated with the under-earth and with water, but which doesn't have legs and doesn't fly. It's associated with the under-earth only. The lung from China, which is associated with the entire water cycle, but it has quite a lot to do with the sky, with clouds, with rain, with thunder, and it flies. And it has arms and legs as well as wings. And there are traces of beliefs in the rainbow serpent too, interestingly. So the people who lived in Southeast Asia before the Mongoloid peoples came in from the north would have been similar to the peoples of Papua New Guinea and Australia. And there are still traces, there are very strong traces of them as you go towards Papua New Guinea and eastern Indonesia, but you also see many people with curly hair and different features from Mongoloid features in Borneo too. So perhaps it's not so surprising that you do find these traces, but the interesting thing is that it's among hunter-gatherer peoples that I found traces of it, which is a little bit more, it's too much what you'd expect somehow, but that is what I found. So I need to next page here, I think. So the origins of the naga, or the minagag, or the lungunan, or whatever they're calling it, among the tribal peoples is generally a snake, and it's usually a python. So it is said that the python, when it becomes very large, it develops a huge head, and it transforms into lungunan, minagag, whatever the local term is. And sometimes, though, it's the king cobra that is said to transform. and the blue coral snake, which we'll come back to. And interestingly, among one group, the Kayan, the blue coral snake, which is poisonous, is said to transform into a dragon. So dragons are present in the landscape. They're very strongly associated with the entire landscape, but particularly with water. Borneo is a very watery place. It's tropical, it rains all the time. In the lowlands, this is what it looks like. You just got water everywhere, little streams, rivers, there's just full of water. And even as you go into the mountains, of course the water's cascading down the mountains, and it comes out of the mountains. It bursts out of the mountains, in fact. So there's an association between dragons and these waterfalls, and which coming out of mountains, and stories about dragons being coiled up underneath the mountain and coming out when it rains very hard. So they actually are the water in some sense, I think. And the dragon expresses, I think, the animation of the landscape in a broad sense. So it's like sentient water, which is the flow of power through the landscape and through life generally. So I do think that understanding people's beliefs about these beings helps to understand people's beliefs about the nature of life itself and the nature of cosmic power and the flow of cosmic power. And water is key to this. So dragons are in the sea, they're in and alongside rivers, they're under the earth, and they're inside mountains. Under the earth, the Chinese in particular talk about dragon lines, and they talk about dragons laying in particular places in the landscape. And this is something I've been trying to follow up in Kuching, because I knew already that there was a dragon said to be resident, to be part of the landscape, with its head in a certain temple and its tail at the Sarawak Museum. I knew about that one, but since then I have heard of others. There are a number of places where there are said to be dragons under the landscape, under the earth, and people try to site their houses vis-a-vis these dragons. So the dragon sort of brings the cosmological layers together, you might say, through the fact that it's associated with water, and expresses the animation of the landscape. And the dragon actually forms the landscape too. So this is from a story which was published by the Borneo Literature Bureau in 1966. It was written in Iban language, but it appears possible that it's a Melanau story. This is another tribal group, but in fact it's probably both. So they call the dragons here king snakes, and these king snakes, the story revolves around the adventures of some humans who come into contact with the king snakes, but eventually the king snakes actually leave the area that they're in, and they create a new river. And so they are the river in some sense. They create the landscape through creating rivers. And as I said, I think the dragon is an expression of cosmic power, of the flow of cosmic power and the sentience of that cosmic power in the context of animistic beliefs. This is expressed through the fact that not just association with the landscape, but the fact that cosmic power is believed to be present more strongly in some parts of the landscape than in others. And one of those powerful points is leaders, human leaders. And they have more cosmic power. And they have leaders among some of the groups that are strongly hierarchical have got special relationships with the more powerful dragons. So to go back to the blue coral snake, this is the case with the Kayan. So Kayan leaders have a special relationship with the blue coral snake, which only they, as a dragon, and only they can see that kind of dragon. Normal people can't. Okay, these are terms for cosmic power in different languages in Borneo. It's a key concept, I believe, and this is something I've been very interested in. I've just written an article about cosmic power and beliefs about stone, because stone and water are at the ends of a continuum between mobility and stasis, you might say, and they're both strongly associated with cosmic power. And these terms are sort of central terms in these languages. So the story about that I was told about Pengulu Kebing among the Kayan expresses this. Last year I went on a field trip up a river called the Baram, and we were seeking with some of the staff at the Sarawak Museum, and we were seeking stories about dragons, and we came across this story about Pengulu, which means chief, Kebing, and so he is said to have had a race with a dragon deriving from the blue coral snake, and he won the race eventually. He was running and the dragon was extending itself very rapidly. So it wasn't running, it was just expanding, you know. And the first time he did the race, he didn't win, but the second time he did. And the fact that he won that race, and some people say it was in a dream, some people say it really happened, but it was said to have happened by a lake on top of a mountain. So I especially looked for a photograph which would express this. A lake on top of a mountain, a very special place, because the top of the mountain is powerful. This is where the most powerful spirits dwell, the most powerful peoples dwell. In Southeast Asia there is a belief that the tops of mountains and the interior of mountainous lands are inhabited by people who are sources of power, even for rajas who will go to prey on these mountains. So the fact that this was on top of a mountain and by a lake is significant, that he had this race, and he won the race, and this gave him the justification to become chief. So after that he became chief. So this is the blue coral snake, which transforms into this particular kind of dragon called the Singyang, an aristocratic dragon, you might say, because these high status people are in literature about Borneo usually called aristocrats. I'm not really sure that's a very appropriate term, because hierarchy in Borneo really isn't the same as hierarchy in Europe, but that's the term that's often used. So you can say, okay, it's an aristocratic dragon, and the fact that he won the race was proof of his cosmic power, his ningan. Now the dragon can be a powerful protector. That's one of its potential roles. Let me just, what was I going to tell you about the, yeah, no, that's just a general, okay. And one of the examples of this is among the Malays. They tell a story about Datuk Merpati, who was one of the first leaders to settle on the coast near Kuching. And he had a son-in-law, apparently, who was a dragon, and who still patrols the coast up and down and protects the area. So that's one instance of the dragon as protector. And among the Chinese is definitely benevolent protector. Chinese always tell you that the dragon is a very good thing, a very friendly thing. It's not scary to them. It's a protector. The Chinese believe that, I don't know if I should go into the detail here. So I mentioned the temple, which was the head of a dragon, and the dragon lines. But there are also, this particular temple is the Tropic temple, and this is the temple of a founder. So throughout Southeast Asia, actually, there are such temples which are associated with earth deities. Some say that the earth deities were brought from China, and some say they are local earth deities. They seem to be a sort of mixture of the two. And I have a friend who is doing research on this, based at the university in Kuching, and she's looking at the ways in which local Dayak beliefs, local tribal beliefs, are mixing with Chinese beliefs, and so that these temples are associated both with Chinese and with local earth deities. So the fact that it's the head of a dragon seems to be associated with this. Now, there were also protective dragons in the river. Among the Kenya, they believe in a dragon which they call straightforwardly Bali Sungai, which means the spirit of the river, which is the protective deity of the longhouse. The Kenya originally were animistic without there being a name for their belief system, which was true of everyone. But in the 19th century, a belief system called Bungan came into Borneo, which was a sort of amalgamation of Christianity and previous beliefs. And Bungan was a sort of mother deity. And there are still Bungan practitioners left. And Bungan practitioners, when we visited the Baram last year, we talked to Bungan practitioners about the Bali Sungai, and they said that it was in a pool below the longhouse, and if children would go down to play and they were going too far in and they were in danger, it would rear up and frighten them and send them back. So it was protecting the children. Definitely protective for the Bungan practitioners. When they become fully Christian, they have mixed views, but we'll come back to that. And among the Kenya, it definitely comes from the python. The Kayan Lungonan, these are the people that have these aristocratic dragons called the Sengyang, but the more plebeian dragon, which everyone can see, is the Lungonan, and this probably derives from the Chinese term lung, actually, I suspect, and this is decidedly protective, and it's very good fortune to encounter this. So I have lots of stories from people about encountering Lungunan in the river and how it brought them good fortune. And even with Christianity, the Kayan have retained a belief that the Lungunan is good. So the photograph here is from Indonesian Borneo. I visited across the border last year to a Kayan area because they are in Indonesian Borneo as well as in Sarawak. And you can see that there is actually a Lungunan, a naga or a lung or a dragon, whatever we're going to call it, on the church. And Pastor Ding, who was the guy who enculturated, because this is the Catholic Church, has overtly been trying to bring in local beliefs, and particularly the Indonesian Catholic Church has been doing this. And Pastor Ding was from this area, and he encouraged people to express their beliefs, in their animistic beliefs really, within the church. And this is his coffin. He was buried with Lungunan holding him up. That's how good they are, even in Christianity. Now we've got the Eben Nirbhau. These are the people who weave the cloths with the dragons on, which I showed you a picture of earlier. And there are many different ways in which the dragon is expressed on these cloths. Pangal Libau is a sort of intermediate world between this world and the spirit world, where culture heroes live. So these are culture heroes from Pangal Libau on this, who transform into dragons. And here we have one which is described as humans changing into Nabau. These are the ways in which this is described. And copulating or dating Nabau. Nabau couples with children. This is actually a photograph of a shawl which I have. Well, I call it a shawl. It's actually, I use it as a shawl, but it's a cloth. These big cloths were draped over furniture and around the longhouse as protective devices. But now they are being promoted for sale. And people buy them to decorate their houses, but you can also use them as a shawl. Now there's another interesting instance of weaving Nabau into cloths among the Iban. When I went to a craft fair in autumn, well, it's not autumn really, there's no autumn in Sarawak, October I think it was, 2 years ago, I encountered this lady, and around her neck she had this. And I discovered that this is something called a labong bungai nuing, which, in fact, even the scholars, there are Iban scholars who look into weaving, they didn't know about these. They're being made for people to carry around as amulets to keep them safe when they're traveling, and they're sold in craft markets. But this one, she said she'd made it in the 60s to sell to soldiers going to fight in the confrontation between Malaysia and Indonesia. And here's another lady who's currently weaving these, and she sells them to people working on oil platforms off the coast at Miri, because it's dangerous there. So you can see how they are most decidedly protective. Now in the mountains in the interior, which is where I did my own long-term fieldwork among the Kalabit, dragons have a different sort of position. You can say they're protective of the environment perhaps, but they're quite scary. Partly this might be because these people have taken up a form of Christianity which is rather fundamentalist. So they've been told that all their previous beliefs are beliefs in Satan's. This is the area, it's called the heart of Borneo, where these people live. And it's the most mountainous part of the island. Although there are also a lot of very small mountains near Kuching, and there are some similar beliefs about dragons coming out of mountains there. In fact, I won't go into that here. But these are the terms that are used among the different peoples of the highlands. Manugug and Galau are the most important ones. But the Kalabit use the term Galau sometimes too, because they live adjacent to each other. Padali is the village where Longhouse, where I did my fieldwork first in 1986 to 88, and have been back many times. These are some of the expressions that you can see of dragons up there. So you've got dragon jars, you've got the asol in the earring, you see a sort of abbreviated dragon, sometimes called a dragon dog, and you've got carvings, curvy carvings, which are also in some sense an expression of the same thing, because you get sentient points on them often. So you have basically a dragon or snake-like entity which becomes sentient because it has an eye, you know. But the modern perception of the dragon is a scary thing. So this is a painting done by Stephen Baya for me. I asked him if he could paint me a dragon, and this is what he painted. So that is a pretty scary creature, isn't it? So they believe that they come from pythons. They come out of hillsides and mountains when there's a landslide as water, and they go down into pools in the river or in rice fields. And you see them only as transformed into something else. If you were to see them in their original form, you would die. This is quite different to the way that the people further down the river see it. As I said, the Kayan and Kenya see them as quite protective. It's great to meet them. But in the Highlands, you don't want to meet them, because if you see them in their original form, you will die. You see them transformed into other animals. And perhaps, as I said, this is because they've taken on this form of Christianity, this fundamentalist form called the Sidang Injil Borneo. And there are beliefs about dragons coming out of an egg. Actually interesting, I'll just throw that in there, which echoes other stories about humans coming from eggs, which you get around Kinabalu, actually, and one of the other mountains in Borneo, but I won't go into that here. So encounters with dragons are often at waterfalls, and I had various stories told to me about encounters with dragons at waterfalls. Let me see, what was I going to tell you here? Yeah, I didn't tell you everything I could have told you about it. So one story was that a man killed a dragon at the waterfall, and they gathered the bones as a charm. So what happened was, he killed the dragon by mistake, because he dropped a stone from the top of the waterfall to the bottom of the waterfall, and by mistake he hit the dragon. And they thought, first of all, when there was a bad smell from the pool, that it might have been a creature that the dragon had partially eaten, because they already thought there was a dragon there. But then when they went, they found the bones of the dragon. And so they took them and they used them as charms. That's one story. Another story I was told was that a group of people went hunting, and they camped by a waterfall. And one man took moss off a boulder. He was picking all the moss off a boulder. And then he had a dream that night in which the Great Spirit appeared to him in the form of an old man. And this was, in fact, the dragon, who told him that he must leave an offering of cigarettes the next day, or else something terrible would happen to him, because he'd done this. And next day he looked at his cigarettes and he thought he didn't have enough. He thought he wouldn't bother. So he didn't. And then there was a huge flood, and it killed all his family, apart from one son. And that one son took refuge in a tree, and he actually says he saw the dragon go by. He saw him whoosh by. So there's a conflation of the dragon with the Adat Raya, literally the great spirit of the forest, who got offended because this man had picked all this moss off the boulder, and took revenge, basically, punished him. There's another story that I was told, which associates the dragon with the Great Spirit. And I'm going to try and play this to you here. And I won't play you the whole of... This is a recording of the guy who told me this story telling it. And you can read it while you listen, assuming this works. We'll see what happens. Let's see. Have you all managed to read it? Yeah? Let's see what happens if I press the next one. He continues to speak. Okay. So this is the sort of conclusion, though. So the dragon here is associated with the Great Spirit, and the dragon protects, the Great Spirit protects the cosmic harmony, and he asked No Dawa to assist him locally in protecting that bit of forest. I wonder if we can stop this sound. If I go to the what?
If you go back, you might switch it off.
You're right, I think you can. Quite correct. That's better, isn't it? So he's a pretty spectacular looking guy. In fact, he's a pretty spectacular guy generally.
Dragon himself.
Is that a python skin?
Yes, it is. Yes, yes. Yeah. This was his father's. Those are tusks, boar tusks that he's got on here. So this was his father's, I think, basically a war coat, actually. You know, most peoples in Borneo did practice headhunting, and now and then, if not continuously, some of them did, like the Iban, as they were expanding, so they were constantly, you know, headhunting, and they're the ones that are famous for it. But everybody participated in it to some extent, and so no doubt that, you know, his father would have gone on war parties and worn these things. So we did actually say, would you sell them to the museum? Absolutely not. No, he certainly would not. He did sell me one of his armlets, so which is a snake, he said. So I've got that. So should the Sarawak Museum go ahead and do an exhibition on the dragon, which I'm hoping they will, they can exhibit that. But no, I mean his outfit is pretty amazing. So this could not have happened in the Kelabit Highlands. But the Kelabit Highlands are the people there where I did my fieldwork are so thoroughly Christianized in this fundamentalist way that I don't think it would be possible for someone to take on the role that he's taken on there. He still goes to church. He doesn't see it as being you know, in conflict with going to church, even though they do belong to the same church as the Kelabit, but they're softer about it. The Lundaya people, they live in the Highlands too, but they aren't as extreme. And I find it rather wonderful, really, to see this, that the dragon is conflated in this way with the Great Spirit and protects the cosmic harmony in this way. So it means that the dragon and the Great Spirit are quite scary too, because if you don't behave properly, you know, that you will get flooded. That's what basically happens. You get flooded. And I had a lot of other stories about people being killed by floods because they'd done things they shouldn't. A lot. Further down too, because the Lundaya live in a large area going right down to the coast. In fact, they probably inhabited Brunei originally. So there are these stories about culture heroes which link Brunei and the Highlands, in fact. So the dragon is custodian of cosmic harmony. So a few conclusions. So it's definitely snaky. Sometimes it's got legs, sometimes it doesn't. It always has a large and complex head. That's what always happens. So whether it's got arms and legs and wings or whatever, when a snake becomes a dragon, it develops this huge head, and it's described as looking like the Chinese dragon. And in fact, what people say is the Chinese know about it, you see. Look, they've made lots of representations of it. They know what it looks like. Ask the Chinese what it looks like. Because people have a conception of it, but they don't really have a clear idea of exactly what it looks like. So on the Iban cloths, you see all sorts of different interpretations. They're all snake-like, and they've all got big heads, but the heads vary quite a lot. So it's open to imagination, but they do think that Chinese have got it nailed. So they'll always ask you to go and ask the Chinese if you really want to know about the dragon. So they see the beliefs they have in water spirits, whatever they call them, they see those entities as being equivalent to the Chinese dragon. They do see an equivalence. So I think I'm justified in using the same term in English for all of these beings, even though they do derive from west and from east, from naga and from lung, and partially from the rainbow serpent. So the beliefs in the rainbow serpent, there's probably you're a little bit interested in this, so it's associated with the rainbow itself, and is said to come out of a hole in the ground where there's a spring. So and they say that when you see a rainbow, that's it. But in fact, I did come across some echo of this among the Bidayu people. I haven't talked about the Bidayu here, the ones who live around Kuching, where there are all these little mountains sticking up. And where they also believe that there are dragons coiled under those mountains. They believe that that dragons live inside springs, and someone told me a story about how his father had fallen head first into one of these once when they were because they go and leave offerings, and he heard all this chattering. There were lots of them down there, as with a lot of other creatures in Borneo. They're said to live in villages of their own, maybe, underground. Not just one of them, but lots of them all living together and talking to each other. So the Bidayu also associate the dragon with springs, and they also mentioned rainbows to me. So it isn't just the Penan. It's the Penan people who are hunter-gatherers traditionally in a more straightforward fashion, who have the beliefs which are closest to the rainbow serpent, but there are traces among many peoples, because many of the peoples of Borneo have only taken up rice cultivation in the last few hundred years, actually, and depended on wild resources entirely or largely until recently, including the Kalabit, even though they say they've never eaten anything other than rice. I worked on a research project up there called the Cultured Rainforest for a few years with some archaeologists, and we found traces well, there's evidence that they were cultivating sago groves, and sago palms are the source of starch that the Penan use, so they're associated with being hunter-gatherers. So it's and we found also evidence that rice is very recent, maybe about 300-400 years old, to say that they really cultivated any significant quantities at any rate. So probably the majority of people in Borneo were largely hunter-gatherers until a few hundred years ago. Although they managed the environment, that's not, because if you're a hunter-gatherer, it doesn't mean to say you're not managing your wild resources. And Graham Barker, the archaeologist with whom I did this research project, he's one of the archaeologists who most strongly emphasizes this. And he and I edited a book called Why Cultivate some years ago, with articles by archaeologists and anthropologists, arguing this, that, there isn't this clear division. All humans manage their environment. It's what humans do. In fact, it's probably what most species do, actually. But when you start cultivating grain, you start doing things a bit differently, because you have a different cosmological relationship with your crop. It starts to get associated with status, with deities, and so on, which with an overarching single deity, so that then that gets associated with the hierarchy too. Okay, so the dragon then. It is a mixture of the naga, the lung, and the rainbow serpent. It's very closely associated with water, and I would suggest it's actually sentient water. Very powerful, very, very powerful. Most powerful being there is, probably, and it's often conflated with the Great Spirit. It's associated with high status. It can be protective and benevolent, but it can threaten people. It's a monitor of cosmic harmony. Whoops. So there's a growing interest in understanding animism in Southeast Asia, and I mean, you're not specialists in Southeast Asia, so you probably don't know this, but there's a book published recently which is called Animism in Southeast Asia. Now, it doesn't include anything on dragons at the moment. However, I'm going to be organising a panel at the conference in Berlin this autumn. And we're probably going to get a publication out of that, and I'll make sure some dragons go in to that. Okay, so that's the end. Thank you very much.